Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, and I am delighted today to be joined by, wow, five powerhouses in the museum field. And despite their shaking their heads, they are. And we're going to talk today about the museum group from its incarnation through its various forms. And I will start out each person and say their name, but you're each welcome to introduce yourself a little bit too. That would be awesome. And then I'm going to go sort of round robin here and play out some questions about the formation of the museum group. We'll also say TMG, the museum group, and talk about the lives and the changing lives over time since the formation of the museum group for independent museum professionals. And without further ado, I'm happy to start with Elaine Gurian. Elaine, do you want to give a little quick bio or intro about yourself before I throw you the first questions?
Actually, no, because the bio is in fact the founding story.
All right. Well, that's a good segue into talking about how and why the museum group was formed.
Great, I'm delighted to be asked to do this. I'm struck by looking at these powerhouse women and understanding they were all my friends for generations and generations, and that they joined TMG at different times, not because there were some interesting reason I started this with a certain group of people, but because we were all working in the museum field and we stopped being salaried employees at different times in the history of the time. I stopped being an employee in 1993 when I had been the deputy director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I had had a history, and the history is important in the first kind of tranche of people. I had had a history of being a deputy director for a long time and helping museums get started, but also being in love with public service and elected office. I loved the world of politics and its way of causing change. I met all of these people, and the very first people of TMG are all personal friends, and then friends of personal friends. And so it gets formed as an idea about the needs of people who had long time worked within the museum field as leadership, and who were now, for reasons that they either had chosen or not, found themselves now in positions to become consultants, which at that time were called all kinds of other things, many of that pejorative. So the history of the time to become a consultant had at the same time a need to change the museum's view of consultancy and to figure out the relationship of people who had been inside and people who were now considered outside with each other, both structurally and emotionally. And I left the Holocaust Museum. I sent out a postcard to everybody on my Rolodex, which was at that time, I don't know, 2000, saying, I've just left the Holocaust Museum. I have no idea what I want to do next. If you have any ideas, write me. And people offered me things to do. And within a year, I had work, but I was in an enviable position. And one of the things you get to talk about endlessly in the tensions of TMG is I was in a position not to need an extraordinary amount of money to maintain my lifestyle. I was older and I had Social Security or the prospect of Social Security. And the determination of how much money one needed to maintain your lifestyle of a life prior to working in TMG is, I think, the central rod of the tension between the definition. I then decided, having been a deputy and having a span of control of 300 people and being incredibly noisy and having endless friends and people I wanted to deal with, I was now in my home with nobody. And I didn't know what to make of that. And the choices were, I thought, to join a group, which you could do. And I don't know if I've ever said that publicly. I interviewed to become a partner in Lord, and I went up to look at Lord and did due diligence. And I thought Lord was extremely well run, and Gail and I liked each other, and I thought they were doing very good work. And so there was no reason not to join them. And what they were going to offer me was just fine. And on the way back from Canada, I realized I had a lifestyle choice to make, and that I didn't want to do that. I didn't want anybody to tell me what I had to do next. I wanted to determine my own clients. And at that point, I realized I needed to do something about my irrepressible need to talk to everybody. And so I called my friends and said, how about, wouldn't that be a good idea? We could talk to each other. It's the beginning of the internet, but not Zoom and other things. And we could meet with each other. So that's one part of the need for friendship. And what I've discovered under COVID, I knew at that time, which was my friends in the museum community was also my source of brain food. That friendship was automatically a part of intellectual conversation, that it wasn't silly and it wasn't frivolous, and that I needed to have a world in which my friendship and my brain food was connected, and discovered that people, for whatever reason, they had decided to become independent museum consultants, and those two words are important. So they were working on their own, but they were not working within a social group, needed to form a social group. And the third part was that I was a politician by nature. And the world of being a consultant was a destructive decision for your profession. You had to leave the profession. You had to cross the street. And so much in America was true that AAM had rules that denigrated being a professor and referred to us as vendors. And because I had been an elected official for so long, I had been in endless meetings where the denigration had taken place. And it was structural. And their view was always that we were the same as packers. Packers was their favorite example. Moving packers. And there was a very long meeting with Ed Abel that Ed Abel ran once before AAM meeting about, which I referred to as no talking in the halls, in which he wanted the AAM board to make rules about whether consultants could walk in the halls and do business, or whether they had to, in the hallway, do business only in the place where booths were.
Yeah, the exhibit hall.
And we were unannounced poachers in the walkways and going to the meetings. So having started a group of friends to help myself not be lonely, and because I also didn't know how consultancy worked, and I remember having an enormously productive conversation with you, Daryl, but this is later, but it tells the beginning. We would ask each other questions about how much do you charge, and do you charge when you're in the airplane, and do you, and I mean, none of us knew how to do this either. And so that was a very interesting thing, because it was very clear to me that independent meant that we were asking for advice from each other. But at least from my point of view, we were not starting a company where we had to vote on what we charged or any of that.
So,
And wait, one more thing you have to know is that I then went with TMG to fight with AAM, a fight I had begun, to change the rules. But because TMG had been founded and didn't exist, I mean, it really is a nothing. It's a decision for people to affiliate, and at that point has no rules. It was amazing to me that Ed Abel thought it was incredibly powerful. And so TMG negotiated with AAM about the rules for consultants when there was no TMG. And I used to call it the smoke and mirrors organization. And we had advisors, because it was very important to me that we had on the letterhead even more powerful people. And Joel Bloom, and the head of, and I've forgotten his name, the head of NSF Science, and
Or
Mike
something, yeah.
and Michael Spock and Levitt agreed. They didn't have to do anything. And that was what allowed us to negotiate. We would have meetings and Joe Bloom would arrive sitting there as the advisor to TMG when TMG didn't exist. And that was how the rules could change. And everybody who had joined TMG, and I think you guys as well, did so out of this need for personal affiliation and company. So it became very important to me that everybody had come from a senior position and everybody had a national reputation, because smoke and mirrors worked from that. The leverage which was invented worked from that. And that wasn't inimical to the way in which I had thought about the place. But as soon as I understood that it had heft where it didn't really have heft, then I realized that was a really important thing. There were many original rule-making tensions, one about how big TMG should be. Is it a small group, a sorority chapter, or is it a national sorority? You wouldn't be surprised to think the more better, the bigger the better, the more smoke and mirrors the better. The other thing you should know is, in order to do the negotiations with AAM, I had done work in looking at definitions of ICOM and other international groups, and they were far ahead of us, and they had already leveled the playing field and had already incorporated independent consultants as kin. And they had already made all the rules. They had recognized each other as siblings. And the US was the last of the big majors to do that.
Why do you think,
there was-
why do you
there was
think
a-
that was?
Ed Abel started his argument with me that the 501c3 not-for-profit status would be taken away by lawyers. That was his first argument. And that was incredibly dispersed immediately. And he personally found it, he did not want to be associated with vendors. It was, so I think it would have happened differently with a different person, but also America had for a very long time thought of a purity, of virtuous purity of the museum inside, and a money-grubbing lack of virtuousness in the outside. And that was very hard to break.
There was a moment when I, having served 6 years as the director of the New England Museum Association, and having been a paid member of AAM for something like 30 years, couldn't be a voting member, but my husband, who had been a trustee of the Computer Museum for 6 months, could be a voting member of AAM.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
But the important part for your records is this tension between helping ourselves get work depending on monetary need, and the importance of the smoke and mirrors getting us national leverage as a secondary attractor to our work, because it boosted our reputation, and the tensions that those brought together.
well, I can't help but think now, as an independent museum professional and also as someone who worked in both children's museums and science centers, neither of which were considered museums at some point in the game, how fortunate we are that there is a much more expansive view of how people can help each other in museums and what's considered a museum. But so thank you, Elaine, for sharing that sort of start of the story. I'd like to ask Daryl, since Elaine mentioned you and also mentioned something that I think is a really important function, not only of TMG, but the life of an independent museum professional, and that's this notion of collegiality and friendship between people. And I think that was especially a very important part, not only in the early days, but the final days of TMG. So I don't know, Daryl, maybe you could start us out and just talk about that other sort of tension there is when you are an independent museum professional. And Elaine touched on it. It's like, it's lonely being in your home office by yourself when you are used to dealing with the hubbub of a museum.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for me, TMG membership was a way to stay connected with other museum colleagues, even after I went off on my own. And that was important to me because my first job in a museum was at the Denver Art Museum. And I don't know, my daughter's 42 right now, and it was a couple of years before she was born, so it's been a while. And I am still really close to Patty Williams and several others in the next generation at the Denver Art Museum. In fact, I saw her a few days ago. So those kinds of museum friends, like Elaine said, are a pretty strong force. And so I miss that. And we had a listserv, I remember. This was in the early days. And it was kind of like the coffee pot, you know? And I would check my email first thing in the morning, and almost always there would be at least a couple of members, colleagues, who posed questions or challenges to the rest of us. And I remember in those days, I thought this was pretty awesome because this was using a technology other than the phone to stay in touch with people, right? And we all had fax machines then too. Um, and business cards and all those antiquated things. But the main thing is that members were incredibly generous about responding to all the queries that were out there. And this went from soup to nuts, believe me, and every type of informal learning environment. But they shared their resources that they had and their own wonderings. And last night, before I went to bed, I decided to pull up a few from my laptop, just going way back to those days in the late 90s. And there were dozens of them, including one about teaching strategies that had been sort of a compilation of ideas from at least a half a dozen of us, maybe more. There was another about mission, vision, and value statements, which were very important then. There was another about benchmarking. And yeah, it was just invaluable to be able to stay in touch with people that way.
Awesome. Thank you. And the way I thought I would do this would be to throw a question out to each of you individually and then see if anybody wanted to respond on that topic. So I'd be happy if anybody else wants to chime in related to this sort of tension of both being alone in terms of our business, but wanting to still be with colleagues and be with friends.
Well, let me add to what both Elaine and Daryl said. When I joined and was invited to join, actually, one of the things I valued without knowing everybody, I knew a few people very well, but I didn't know everybody in the group. What I valued was the criterion about experience in the field and leadership in the field, so that I felt it wasn't a group of people who lost their jobs and told everybody they were consulting, right? People were serious about the work they were doing. It wasn't just between job kind of activity. And I was not between job. I was really pursuing a consulting career. And so that was, before I knew anybody, that was really important. And I think it created a kind of credibility around the group that everybody in it had a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom. And even if we didn't have a lot of time on task as consultants, we still had a lot of bonds. And so not knowing anybody or only knowing a couple of people, I made the decision to join or accept the invitation because those were the people I wanted to connect with, right? I wanted to learn from people who really, really were smart about this. And the collegiality was a byproduct. I mean, I didn't even realize how important that was until I was well into TMG. And I think the smoke and mirrors thing was aided by the fact that the group, we were an imposing group when you got us all together. And I think that helped. So the criteria around leadership and seniority and became a bit of a problem later on because it looked so exclusive and non-inclusive, et cetera. But initially I thought, and I'm speaking very personally, it was important to be able to stand with a group of people who had so much experience and so much credibility. And the second thing, and then I'll stop, is that I was really at the front end of my consulting career. I'd always worked in either museums or nonprofit organizations. And when I became a consultant, I wasn't really clear whether I wanted to be a sole practitioner or a business, whether I wanted to have a practice or a business. And I think TMG, that was one of the questions I came in with. I could make that decision at that early point in my consulting career. And I thought, what do I want to be? Do I want to be a sole practitioner? Do I want to form a firm? And I came out on the side of sole practitioner because I first of all, I kind of hate managing a lot of people. If anybody's worked with me or been in a meeting with me, knows that I can be really impatient. But all I had to sell was my time and my expertise. And if I widened the circle to have a business, I began to worry about the quality of the work falling off a little bit, where I always knew that I could control the quality of the work and I could control, to a certain extent, the relationships I had with clients. And I didn't desire to have that kind of diluted. So I'll stop there. But that was, when I wasn't part of the group and didn't realize how collegial everybody was, that's what motivated me to say yes to the invitation.
It's interesting. I was just part of now there is an independent museum professionals group that exists, and I was part of a webinar talking. There's still this need and tension. People are applying their craft as independent people, and it is often a lonely exercise, and how to stay connected with people and colleagues and friends in the field is can still be a challenge. Laura Roberts, hello.
Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself or a little bit before I throw you a question here?
Sure. So I was a museum educator for at 3 different places before I decided that if I had to do any more museum education, I would go crazy. So I went to business school and retooled myself as a manager. Um, Ran the New England Museum Association for 6 years and realized that I would never have as good a job because it allowed me to sort of float over the entire field and see the whole field and not get bogged down into any one set of problems for a long time, like raising money. So really becoming a consultant was the right next step for me. And Ann Butterfield knew me well and knew that um, where I was at the time was not a great fit and said, I think you should quit your job and I think you should become a museum consultant and come join TMG. So it all happened in a single conversation. I didn't do a day of consulting before I joined TMG. That's not quite true. In one transition, I had done about 6 months of consulting, but I hadn't done a single day of consulting before I joined TMG.
So but that's actually what I want to talk with you about. Like, what, like thinking you want to take that step and actually taking that step to become a consultant, as Maureen indicated, not just because you lost a job and like, oh, okay, now I'm a consultant, but to make that conscious decision. I just, if you could dig into that a little more, because I think it's super interesting why people take that step.
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Like Maureen, I hate managing people. And it's a certain point in your career, that's just part of what a senior job is. And if you don't like doing it, you got to figure out something else to do. And our institutions aren't really big enough to support a lot of people who still do the work that they loved. Patty Williams is one of the exceptions at Denver, that she can be a senior teacher and not be a manager. So I didn't really want to manage. I certainly didn't want to raise money for an organization. And I wanted the variety that the New England Museum Association job had given me, the ability to go from one thing to another. And in some ways, being director of NEMA, I could, although I had to be responsive to my members, I could also pick what I wanted to go from one thing to another. And I think that's really important for most consultants, that they can direct their own time. They can direct their own practice, build their practice, shape their practice. Um, and like Elaine, I was not operating with, I've got to take every job that I possibly can in order to pay my household bills. I was fortunate that way. And also, my husband I'm a little younger than Elaine, so I didn't have Medicare. And this was before Obamacare, or in Massachusetts, we used to call it Romney Care. And I had the good fortune that my husband was leaving a major corporation and we had Cobra. And so I could figure out stuff like health insurance and buying a new computer and setting up my home office. So it was a very soft landing. But the other thing, to be totally honest, was that my husband and I quit our jobs at the same time. And we really did it for the
Gutsy.
Yeah, we did it within 2 months of each other. But it was deliberate. It was because we both wanted the flexibility of being in control of our time and being able to travel more easily and um, just uh, we viewed it as being sort of take some of our retirement time now and structure our lives more flexibly. And that's one of the reasons why I never wanted to go join a firm. I also was offered a job by a pretty big consulting firm. I was offered a job by TDC about at the same time I was doing it. And I realized I just didn't, like Elaine, I didn't want someone else to be managing my time. And
So that's, yeah, Elaine, go ahead.
Paul, one of the things you should know, I look at Laura and I remember in the founding of the first set of members, there was not only the few people I knew who were consultants, there was also this hope that we could get in that group who knew other people who had skills we didn't have. And so we had a computer wonder, and the fact that Laura had gone to business school was not lost on us. So Laura becomes she does all the technical founding 501c3 stuff for us. We have no idea how to do. It's why it's founded in Boston. Well, we were there in Boston, but and she becomes the second president or the first president?
oh, I wasn't the first president. I might have been the third or fourth president, but I was treasurer for life.
For life.
I'm treasurer again. I was treasurer for life because it's like all these really, really smart people, and I'm the only person who seemed to be able to add and subtract.
But it's not that we don't know how to add and subtract. I object to that. It's that we have no idea how to put the columns to get them to reconcile and look like the other things are supposed to look like.
So this is super interesting. It's like you've I can't help but refer back to my comic book knowledge. Like you've assembled the Avengers, this dream team.
Yes, we assembled the Avengers, and then we would have assembled all these Avengers, but they were at work elsewhere. Right. They were not eligible.
That's another interesting tension in the early days, which I think, Paul, it continues. And you actually, Paul, have been in some ways on the other side of that piece of tension. And that is the degree to which we exist to provide colleagueship, support, problem solving, and all of those other things, and the degree to which we exist to help everybody get more business. And there were a couple of people in the first group. I'm thinking Bill Talbot. He was
he left over this.
He left over this. It's like, no, unless we're in the exhibit hall selling ourselves to people who are coming to AAM, I don't know why I'm in the group. And it's been somewhat gendered over the years, this tension. It has threatened to tear us apart several times. Now, we did have a deal where if two or more of you were going after a project, you could use the TMG name. And we also, Catherine Hill and I, spent an enormous amount of time thinking about how to structure the payback for using the TMG name. Yeah. Was this like when you were an actor and your agent got you a job, and so you paid back to your agent 10%? Yeah.
Or like a finder's fee or something.
A finder's fee or a credential or whatever. It never worked out. And I think I would guess there have been less than 6 contracts out there over the years that were awarded to TMG as TMG. Two of
And-
them.
And it didn't work out because we knew right away, back to Maureen's comment, we were all seniors. The way in which it works out is that you're not all seniors. We could never make it work out financially. Could never, our very appeal to ourselves and our very quality was why we weren't a good business, which is what Maureen understood more than anybody.
The other part of this is that so putting these teams together, I once, for example, beat a TMG team for a contract. I think Mary Ellen was on the TMG team. It was
Oh, that must have gone over really
Yeah.
big.
Could be.
yeah.
Well, Mary Ellen Munley, I just wanted to, I want to give you another one of these tension questions because I'm seeing that there are sort of different tensions at work here. Even though all of us have been employed in museums, I'm going to dare say that we all have a strong independence streak, which maybe contributes both to our inside museum careers and our outside museum careers. But I was just curious about a different tension, Mary Ellen, and I'll just throw you this question. This tension between needing to serve some practical business aspects of things, like presumably we do want to have consulting work or independent work and raise money, but also the need and the desire to share things to help raise the field. And that is that seems like a dynamic tension, maybe not only with TMG, but maybe it's a dynamic tension in the whole museum field, this need to, of course, make money, but also the need, I think one of the strengths of the museum field is this willingness in general for people to share information to try and continue to raise and improve the field. So I've given you a huge question there, but you can pick apart any part of it you want, Mary Ellen, and then I'd just be curious for other folks to chime in.
Okay, well, thanks. I mean, as we said earlier, I was not one of the early founding members of TMG. I didn't join until, and I wasn't invited to join until 2004. So it had been in operation for quite some time. But when it was founded in 1996, I was at the Field Museum. I had come from a job at the New York State Museum to the Field Museum to be director of education. And prior to that, I had been the research assistant for Museums for a New Century. And so somewhat like what you were talking about, Laura, very, very early in my career, I was introduced to the broad span of the museum field, all the way from the nitty-gritty things to what was the role of museums in society. And I just got, taken with all of that. And I had the opportunity to find and also learn from an incredible group of people from different fields, inside and outside of the museum, as Ellen Hersey and I, were the staff members for this Museums for a New Century. And so it was in that context that I knew most of the people who were those founding members of TMG, because they were also the people who were within the museum field, who were right there sort of making the change and thinking through what was the role of museums in society, how was that changing, what did we need to be thinking about. And just looking back a little bit, and we sort of knew it at the time, but Museums for a New Century, the task force was formed in the early 1980s. The publication came out December of 1983. So sort of 1984. The only precedent for a group of people to be put together to think about museums was the Belmont Report, which had been done back in the 1960s, the late 1960s. And its purpose, I'm saying that I'm running out of battery here, its purpose was to put together the case for the federal government about what financial needs museums in the country would have going into the future. Now, the purpose for the Museums for a New Century was to figure out and to articulate what was the purpose of museums. What do museums have, and what do they have to give to our society? So it was a very different take on museums. And I think that began, or at least it surfaced, conversations within the museum field about audiences, about public service, about, visitor-centered. I mean, just all those things that just sort of started to percolate there in the late 1980s. And then coming out of Museums for a New Century, where one of the big things in it, I thought, well, everyone thought, was making both the curatorial parts of the museum and the education, the public education parts of the museum of equal importance in terms of the role of museums. That point was made very strongly, very clearly, and many of the people who are part of TMG, as well as some of the members of the Museums for a New Century, were carrying that message into the field. And it was a fairly foreign message, and it was one that had a lot of, to use your word, Paul, tension to it. It took about 4 years from when the report came out to the founding of another group, which was a task force that then produced the publication Excellence in Equity, which became something that was really important in the field and was grasped. But it took 9 years from when Museums for a New Century was published and when Excellence in Equity was published. And I think that suggests or gives some credence to the fact that this was a major paradigm shift in the museum world. And that just takes me to the place where what I think the museum group did, the way I saw it when I was still working in museums, was that the folks in the museum group were carrying a lot of the sensibility and responsibility for this paradigm shift. And the way I knew TMG in those early years was that, I would attend the conversations and was very taken with the fact that this was a group of people who wanted to talk about and knew how to talk about unsettled issues, as Elaine calls them. And many of the people there were taking risks in their own work. They were challenging some people. Once you got to know one another pretty well, we would get to know some of each other's stories in terms of maybe, let's say, not being as well accepted within our own institutions as we were out in the world of, thinking about and working at that other level in terms of the role of museums in society. So I think the founding of the museum group at that time in 1996 was really important for the field. And because it allowed people who maybe weren't as comfortable inside institutions to be able to do work and to be able to do good work and to be recognized. And so I think that was another one of the elements, in addition to some of the things that were talking about, Elaine, in terms of why the TMG get founded then. And so I think some of these historical things might have contributed to the overall environment that made it so important to have people who were recognized as credible, dealing in these issues that were new, and who had experience across institutions, so that when you're dealing with something like systemic change, even though you go in at a particular project or for a particular period of time, you sort of got it in terms of what the real task was here. And so museums who were looking to do this new work in terms of the public dimension and didn't know how to do it, they could find people in TMG who could help them. And people in TMG who were trying to do this, there were people in the field who were inside institutions and trying to do this work, but ran up against blockades, had a place to go, where they could still practice. And that, anyway, that's my little
That's
take on one of the reasons that the founding of TMG at that particular time was of interest, and also I think helped to form what it became and how it was viewed in the field.
Daryl.
But you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, just thinking in terms of these different tensions that we all learned to navigate one way or the other. When I was hired as the director of education at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, it was to create a new kind of education department. You know, as I had grown up with at the Denver Art Museum, which was my first museum home. And so it was to offer something different from the, what would you say, traditional walk and talk tours by docents who were like the dispensers of information that had been fed to them by curators. But it was an uphill battle for me to create new types of experiences for visitors, because curators and conservators and other discipline-based experts who were my colleagues on the staff were pretty skeptical of me because I was doing some, I guess, unconventional and
Heaven
unfamiliar.
forfend a museum would do anything unconventional.
Right, or even unsafe. So safety, you know, was always a big consideration for the care of the collection. And so one time I created this experience for families, which meant people of all ages, parents, grandparents, as well as children. And we got past the safety barrier because we decided to do it outside on the plaza. The Indianapolis Museum of Art then had this beautiful, huge plaza. There were no works of art out there except maybe a few permanent sculptures that had been installed. And so we had a temporary exhibit of work by Jackie Ferrara, who some of you might know is doing these incredible geometric shapes. And so we got a local lumber company to donate, I don't know, they must have been 1x2s in a variety of lengths, you know, as short as 2 feet and as long as 6 feet. And we had these cool ways of stacking them in different cubby holes so that you could know what you were pulling out. And then people were building their own sculptures on the plaza. But that was pretty radical. And I really rocked the boat there, I guess. So when I left that museum and started working as a consultant, there wasn't so much of that tension because usually I had been hired by the director or some pretty senior person at the museum. And so whatever the project was, I had their support. And so therefore I also had the ears of staff members from most departments at least. So yeah, I mean, there were always these tensions. When people would ask me what I did, and I would say, oh, I'm a museum consultant, they would say, wow, that must be really interesting. This is like Chinese fortune cookie, may you live an interesting life. Because nobody calls a museum consultant when everything is going along smoothly, right? Why would they do that? And I mean, except when you get a grant, and then that's a wonderful opportunity, a really happy occasion for the institution and the consultant and the staff to work together to explore new options that never existed before. But at least when it came to my board development work, that there was always an issue that became more and more clear and contentious the longer I spent in the museum. You might have found some of this to be true too, Maureen. And I remember there was one museum that will be unnamed where I came home and I was talking to my husband that night and he said, how was your day? And I said, well, I feel like I just had to do an intervention today between the curator and a couple of her colleagues on the staff. It was intense. But the way I managed to, I don't know, get through all those was just that I had this idea that I wasn't the kind of consultant who came in with answers. But if I could figure out the right questions to answer, then I usually found that there was the experience and wisdom and even grace of people seated around the table to figure out the answers together.
Paul, I want to put what Daryl has said back to what Mary Ellen said. One of the things that happened historically, and I think Mary Ellen has presented this very interesting sense of what happened when we all then appeared together carrying our own histories, was that the role of consultant itself became something that could be used in a museum, and that's what Daryl is talking about, outside the internal control of the museum. It became another avenue of leverage and change. And it got connected with the fact that we had fought the good fight to change the structure, so that we were now savory, if you will, and therefore people could hire us at a level above the staff, which had somehow elevated us, but also allowed the staff to project on us. I always used to say, you could be as mad as you want about me. I'm going home at the end of today. And that became a role in the pantheon of usefulness for directors that might not have ever happened had we remained vendors. I used to say I would have hired consultants had I stopped being as so much hubris, and if I had known what they could have done for me, because they became another fulcrum for looking at ideas or looking at tensions within a museum, because Daryl could do an intervention that the director couldn't do with less damage and more effectiveness. So.
Right, because I was getting on a plane the next day or the
That's
day
right.
after that.
I'm
and the
leaving.
Director wasn't.
That's
And
right.
they were paying you, right? They were paying you. So that demanded a certain amount of attention as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and the fact that we were well known, that we came with, and that's back to Mary Ellen said, we came with a known history, added the possibility of us being paid, of us being there. They had bought us somebody. And those things are all intertwined here.
And it goes back to the collegiality, Elaine, because when we got together, we would give each other the inspiration and the strength to continue to be change agents.
We
And
also gave each other work, like.
yes,
Yeah.
that too. That too. But
People would call me and I'd say, I'm not the right one. One of you is the right one. All of us did that.
But sitting around the table would be someone who, many people who would be ahead of me on thinking about something.
Yes,
Right.
on every issue.
On every issue, Mary Ellen and Daryl talking about race, Jim Volker talking about visitor experience. I mean, there were always someone to push you to go someplace else with and to embolden you by watching your peers to say, I guess I can be gutsier too.
We also had each other's back, which was really interesting. You could call each other. I did with impunity.
Yeah.
And get advice. So I appeared smarter than I ever was. So, because the job of consultant is itself smoke and mirrors. It's a projective test. It's an internalized external way of having your ideas out there looked at and then turned around and given back to you.
Well, one of the things I wanted to point out, it may sound very kind of routine or mundane, is that we were incredibly generous to each other.
Yes.
No one ever had a product or a tool or an idea that was treated as a proprietary, right? It was there to be shared. And we could all talk to each other and feel comfortable knowing that none of what we said, no matter how critical or, out there it might be, would never get broadcast, right? It would never go outside the room. And we tried, I think, in a couple of ways to just create an ethos around that through the mechanical things you do as an organization. So I remember we used to spend the front part of every meeting with people talking about whatever their current project was. And it became weirdly competitive as everybody had to appear successful and glamorous. And I think Laura said, why don't we stop doing that? Because not everybody's working with big clients, not everybody's working on long projects. And to always have to hear that your peer is seems to be doing so much better than you are is just demoralizing to the group at the front end. So we would always look for ways, I think, to sort of make material some of our philosophical desires to create really strong working relationships, ones that had confidence and a lot of generosity. And then we would call each other separately, right? I often ran into terrible problems in the course of consulting. And your client's not your friend, right? It's not your friend. And so you need someplace where you can sort of lay out what the problem is and have someone tell you, well, you're not crazy, or you should get out of that as quickly as you possibly can. And so that was another thing that at a practical level was just so important to be able to tap. And all the other benefits kind of flowed around it and flowed out of it. But I just remember the ability to talk in the group, to go to the group, and feel comfortable and safe in saying or doing whatever it was you brought into the room. And that was one of the most important things for me.
But the reverse was equally important, at least to me, which was, thank you for sharing. And I now I have a way to look at it, but I don't have to do it. This
Mhm.
notion of preserving the independentness of each of us. You do it this way and it works for you. And it was a kind of understanding that lifestyle decisions were the reason we had gotten into this in the first place and needed to be respected as well. And so that the thing that Laura and I said about having other means of income, we didn't have the hubris to expect that other people needed to do anything the way we did that they had different determinants, different age children, different stresses at home, and that the generosity was really an understanding of giving advice without expectation. And Lord knows that we were all going to places where people expected that the advice was supposed to be somehow magical, was going to change their lives forever. We didn't even have any tension about that, which I thought was miraculous. There was no need to leaven us or to make us all consistent with each other. Nobody pushed for it, which I personally thought was really incredible.
I think we give each other work a lot. I think we recommend each other a lot. We hand off jobs, we collaborate on jobs, and
Yeah, which would suggest one of the things was deep respect for the work each other was doing. That we felt completely happy to hand off jobs to each other.
And to share jobs with one another, right?
yeah.
I mean, one of my greatest joys was teaming up with other TMG members to collaborate on projects together. And over the course of the years, I had opportunities to work with many members. No one more than Mary Ellen, and we had some doozies, didn't we?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we worked on several wonderful IMLS grants for the Denver Art Museum over the years. We had some fun and also some challenges at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Oh, and then there's the Journey Museum in South Dakota, where that we could tell some stories about that. But it was all better because it was shared, right?
Yes.
If I had gone to Rapid City, South Dakota by myself, I would have been a basket case. But the fact that we were there together and with Randy, it was good. And yeah, and Laura and I got to work on some writing projects together. I had written some sort of like training manuals for the Museum Trustee Association. And I got to work with Laura on this 4-volume set.
Well,
I don't know, maybe we did 3 volumes together. I guess I had done one before, but right?
no, I can't remember, but that's a really good example, Daryl, about the ethos of TMG, because Daryl had written it with another co-writer.
Right.
And the new executive director of MTA couldn't find Daryl. Now, it's really hard in the age of the internet to not be able to find somebody with the public presence of Daryl Fischer, but I don't know. Maybe she spelled her name wrong. And she called me and she said, we want to reissue templates for trustees. Will you revise them? And I said, gee, Daryl doesn't want to do them. And she said, oh, I can't find Daryl to ask her.
That's
And
weird.
my response was, okay, there's no way I'm doing this to my friend and colleague, Daryl. And I said, I'm calling Daryl.
Yeah,
If
so we
Daryl,
did 3 of the 4 in second and third editions.
yeah, if
Yep.
Daryl doesn't want to do this, then we'll talk. But I'm not going to take this project away from Daryl Fischer. Don't be ridiculous.
I didn't even know that. And then there were also another, wonderful aspect of being a consultant is working with colleagues even outside of TMG.
Right.
And these kind of extended projects that we have. I got to work with Beverly Sorrell and Deborah Perry over the course of 4 years. Well, the Detroit Institute of Arts was reinstalling its entire permanent collection. And those, when I think back on my whole career, those collaborations are the best parts, not more than the times that I was working independently.
But what's important about what you've just said is because we could make independent decisions, Daryl could work with others. We weren't a company and we didn't control each other's time. And so we picked each other because we liked each other to work with, but they weren't the only people we liked or had to work with.
Yeah.
I need to go back to Mary Ellen because I've found your presentation fascinating. Once you went inside TMG, did your sense of what it was like outside bear out, or was it totally different?
What do you mean by the sense of that got bared down?
Well, there were people who were now taking risks, but had.
Oh. Yes, I think it did, and it certainly bore out that I could find and that others could find support for work, and that there were places in the museum field where people were either doing the work really well and you could sort of join in as an independent, or who wanted to do the work. So it was a more positive place to practice from, for sure. It was a healthier place to practice from. For me, the internal politics of a place like the Field Museum, where you have, scores of scientists who are protecting their turf when there's to be this expansion of the use of resources for, public programming, was extremely intense. And I'm not as much of a political animal as you are, Elaine. And for someone like me, that became almost pretty much like a no-brainer. It was fascinating to discover that you could go into a place like that and you're brought in to make change. You work with a whole bunch of people and you make the change, and all of a sudden the institution looks at it and says, oh, well, not like, this is not what we thought it was gonna be like. It's like
Yeah.
the person who stands on, at the mezzanine at the Field Museum and looks down at Stanley Field Hall and says, oh, now we have the fanny pack people. How did that happen? Or, now we have children from the, Chicago public schools, and it's noisy in here on a Wednesday. This is not what we had in mind. So
Right.
so I don't know if that answers your question, but it was just an entirely different environment, and thank God it was there for me to be able to work in.
Great. Well, I certainly appreciate everything that everyone shared today. I hesitate to ask my last question, which is to see if anybody has any final thoughts, because that could take another hour and a half with this group. But I'll still ask that question if anybody has any final thoughts they'd like to share.
Well, one of my thoughts is about why TMG is at this point closing down. It had been slow for, I would guess, the last 5 to 7 years. And part of it was that younger people had another resource. And so they had built or invested in the independent professionals section of AAM, which was great. That they weren't nearly as lonely, I think, as we were. And that's important because, as one of our members points out, you have to want it, right? You have to be in, if you're going to be in the group, to make the group work, you have to want it to work, and be really have an appetite for seeing each other and working together. And it was very hard to develop that with newer members. And it just became more and more difficult. Was when someone said to me, what's the value proposition? And I thought, where to begin? But these were all intangibles that we had created over time. And I think it was just understand, in organizational terms, it was understandable that that was going to be hard to maintain. But when it was vibrantly going as a concern, TMG, you just couldn't beat it. I mean, you just could absolutely not beat it as a place to never be alone, have friends, have good advisors, have smart people. And as I said before, an ethos around sharing and being attentive to each other that you couldn't develop outside that group in such an automatic way. We all automatically began to do those things. So that was my final thought is what happened that we can't be this group anymore? And it was a very natural thing that happened. But it touches on all the things we've talked about in this segment.
I think it's a mark of generosity that a group also recognizes with grace that it has done its service, and now the service has gone gracefully elsewhere and decides to go out of business instead of clinging to its memory. I'm pleased to tell you how it began. I was thrilled to be part of it for all the reasons, but I'm very impressed that the remainder people who were there when I was no longer there, seeing the end of it, so gracefully and generously decided to dissolve it. I think the end is as impressive as the beginning.
As we know, in both the museum sphere and the political sphere, that doesn't always happen.
Absolutely not.